So, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie, or as I like to call them, the three godfathers of modern day American capitalism, they were not the only lying, thieving colonizers that were dooming this country to hell. But they do stand out in my mind as key players in the brand of predatory late stage capitalism that we have today. Because these three together raised all kind of hell. These three together scaled the economic system to unprecedented heights through the use of monopolies, which J.P. Morgan perfected. And they did this using human bodies and souls as building blocks and cannon fodder. Like these three men, if these three men didn't exist, I often wonder where we would be today, because so much of what is going on today can be directly traced back to the shit that they did. Now, before I get into these three godfathers and detail them for you so you know exactly who the fuck and what the fuck you're dealing with as far as their legacies are concerned, it's worth mentioning that by the time JP Morgan and them came on the scene in the 1870s, the American economy was running absolutely wild. And that's because there was so much fraud going on. I mean, the fraud was like a runaway train, which is a really apt metaphor considering that it's mainly the railroad people who were causing this fraud. Go back and watch the last part for a little bit more detail on that. So JP Morgan steps in and he's like, you know what? I am going to appoint myself the great stabilizer, and I'm going to stabilize this economy because, and I quote, we do not want financial convulsions and have one thing one day and another thing another day. So he steps in and he starts trying to stabilize the economy. How does he stabilize the economy? Monopolies. And he creates these, he's the OG monopoly man. He creates these monopolies, and through that, he eliminates both foreign and domestic competition. He keeps prices high and he keeps wages abysmal. And we're still using that same primary model today in 2025. And by the way, speaking of Monopoly, do you have a box of Monopoly at the house? Take it out, look at it. Tell me who that Monopoly man looks like. As far as the three godfathers of modern day American capitalism go, J.P. Morgan was the top dog. He started out as the son of a banker and he was selling railroad stocks for really pricey commissions. And once he made his fortune off of these commissions, he started scheming people out of money by inflating the product value of the things he was selling. Think Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street. Where do you think he learned it from? Okay, so JP Morgan rose to prominence via banking. When you think JP Morgan, think banking. He had his grubby, pasty, greedy little fingers in all types of industries, but banking is where he got his start, i.e. JP Morgan Chase. So he rose to prominence via banking, and he started buying as many companies as he possibly could and merging them together to create monopolies. And eventually, Morgan amassed, excuse me, Eventually, Morgan amassed enough wealth to loan gold to the government. The United States government ran out of gold, and because the bankers were hoarding it all. Matter of fact, in 1895, which is when the gold reserve of the United States was depleted, 26 New York City banks had $129 million of gold in their vaults. Hang on, give me 1 second. I'm going to look up how much money that is in 2025 terms. Okay, that would be $4.9 billion. 26 New York City banks had $4.9 billion. And so what the bankers did, JP Morgan and Company, August Belmont and Company, and the National City Bank and others, they offered to give the government gold in exchange for bonds, meaning loans. So the government sold these loans that they had given out to people to these bankers, JP Morgan and them. And then the bankers immediately turned around and sold off those same loans that they had just received in a deal from the government and made an $18 million profit. So the way that JP Morgan stabilized the economy was by controlling everything. And so he linked railroads to one another because he owned many railroads. He linked the railroads to each other under one company. And he linked all of those railroads to banks and then the banks to insurance companies. And then by 1900, he controlled 100,000 miles of railroad, which was half the country's mileage. This man had more money than God. Matter of fact, 3 of his insurance companies had over $1 billion in assets. That's $1 billion in 1895 money, mind you. It's probably like $1 trillion today. And then he amassed that wealth, that $1 billion of those three combined companies, he amassed that wealth by selling overpriced insurance to regular people. Similar to how car lobbyists today in Congress make car insurance required so that then they can funnel the same people who are buying cars to the insurance companies and make money off of that. I wonder who owns both the car insurance companies and the car manufacturing companies. The next godfather we have is Mr. John D. Rockefeller. Now, when you think JP Morgan, you think what? Banker. When you think John D. Rockefeller, what you should think about is oil. He's the one who started Standard Oil Company. So, Rockefeller started as a bookkeeper and then he became a rich merchant. Obviously, he was very good with numbers. And then after he made his money being a merchant, he bought an oil refinery. So in Rockefeller's mind, whoever controlled the oil controlled the industry. And so he would go and make secret agreements with the railroads to ship only with them. So he went to these railroads and he told them, I'm going to only ship my oil with you if you give me a rebate, aka if you give me a discount. And so they would offer him a discount, and he would give them a shit ton of business. This eventually drove smaller oil refineries out of business. And then if any other oil refinery, any smaller oil refinery would try to ship their oil on the same railroads that John D. Rockefeller had deals with, he would sabotage them in any number of ways. And a matter of fact, Howard Zinn details this one story where one of his oil refinery rivals in Buffalo was rocked by a small explosion, thereby putting them out of business. And then come to find out, he had paid a chief mechanic to cause the explosion. One independent oil refiner said, quote, if we did not sell out, we would be crushed out. There was only one buyer on the market and we had to sell at their terms. John D. Rockefeller was the one who started Chase Manhattan Bank. And you know who was his friend? JP Morgan. JP Morgan Chase. Right. Howard Zinn writes, the Standard Oil Company by 1899 was a holding company which controlled the stock of many other companies. The capital was $110 million. The profit was $45 million a year, and John D. Rockefeller's fortune was estimated at $200 million. Before long, he would move into iron, copper, coal, shipping, and banking. Profits would be $81 million a year, and the Rockefeller fortune would total $2 billion. That's $2 billion in 1899 money, mind you. Next up, we got Andrew Carnegie. Now, when you think JP Morgan, you think what? Banker. When you think John D. Rockefeller, you think oil. Now, when you think about Andrew Carnegie, think steel. That's how he really made his riches. He was in the steel industry. So he was a telegraph clerk at the age of 17, and he then became the secretary to the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So if you think about the show The Gilded Age, if you've watched The Gilded Age, George Russell's secretary, I believe his name is Clay, that would be like what the role that Carnegie played to the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad when he was younger. Then he became a broker in Wall Street selling railroad bonds for huge commissions. Pretty soon he was a millionaire. Once he became a millionaire, which was in like the early 1870s, he went to London and learned about the new Bessemer method of producing steel. And I realized this as I was reading this, Bessemer, as in Bessemer, Alabama, as in the suburb or the urban suburb, whatever, just outside of Birmingham. Birmingham was a really big steel industry place. And I'm thinking like that must be what they named Bessemer after, is the Bessemer method. But the Bessemer method, just to be clear, was a method of hardening iron into steel. Now, before the Bessemer method, the rate was 3 to 5 tons a day. Once the Bessemer method was implemented, iron could be hardened into steel at 3 to 5 tons in 15 minutes. So it was very innovative. But anyway, so he went to London in 1872. He saw the new Bessemer method of producing steel, and then he returned to the United States to build a $1 million steel plant. Foreign competition was kept out by high tariffs conveniently set by Congress. Congress was paid off. Watch the former part. And in 1880, Carnegie was producing 10,000 tons of steel a month, making $1.5 million a year in profits. And by 1900, he was making $40 million a year. And that year, at a dinner party, he agreed to sell his steel company to JP Morgan. He scribbled the price on a note. This was at a dinner party. You want to know how much he sold his steel company to Morgan for? $492 million. And for this next part, I'm just going to read it directly from the book because Howard Zinn says it better than I ever could. Morgan then formed the U.S. Steel Corporation, combining Carnegie's corporation with others. He sold stocks and bonds for $1.3 billion, which was about $400 million more than the combined worth of the companies. And then took a fee of $150 million for arranging the consolidation. So not only did he pay himself $400 million because he inflated the value of even the companies that he was selling, but he then paid himself an extra $150 million for arranging the consolidation, i.e. the monopoly. How could dividends be paid to all those stockholders and bondholders? One, by making sure Congress passed tariffs keeping out foreign steel, and by closing off competition and maintaining the price at $28 a ton. And two, by working 200,000 men 12 hours a day for wages that barely kept their families alive. And so it went, in industry after industry, shrewd, efficient businessmen building empires, choking out competition, maintaining high prices, keeping wages low, using government subsidies. These industries were the first beneficiaries of the welfare state. By the turn of the century, American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, had a monopoly of the nation's telephone system. International Harvester made 85% of all farm machinery, and in every other industry, resources became concentrated, controlled. The banks had interest in so many of these monopolies as to create an interlocking network of powerful corporation directors, each of whom sat on the boards of many other corporations. According to a Senate report of the early 20th century, Morgan, at his peak, sat on the board of 48 corporations. 48. Rockefeller, 37 corporations. So I think now I've made myself pretty clear about why I consider J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie the three godfathers of modern day American capitalism. Of course, they did not invent capitalism. That would be ridiculous to say, and I'm not an idiot. But they fucking for sure perfected it. They perfected that shit. And they did it by making sure that they were able to get their hands on every single lever of control that they could find. And then they systematically went through and they eliminated foreign and domestic competition. Because, by the way, banning women from the workplace, banning black people from higher positions, that was a way of eliminating domestic competition, while the tariffs eliminated foreign competition. So they eliminated competition. They deliberately kept the prices of what they were selling high by inflating the value of their own products. And they kept wages abysmal. And this is how, through all of this, this is how we got to where we are in 2025 America. And in the next part, we're going to talk about what regular people were doing while these robber barons were robbing them the fuck blind.